Hi, I'm Chloe Harper, and I never imagined a charity gala could feel so tense. As I arranged the tables, my husband whispered with a smirk, "You're just the planner after." I froze, cheeks burning, and felt everyone's eyes on us. Then the main sponsor called my name, and the room went completely silent. I couldn't believe what was about to happen next. The ballroom looked exactly how I had envisioned it 3 years ago, when this charity was just a sketch in my notebook. Crystal centerpieces caught the light, and the auction items gleamed on velvet displays. I had chosen every flower, every napkin fold, every song on the playlist. Daniel stood near the bar, laughing with colleagues, completely unaware that I had overheard him. My hands trembled slightly as I straightened a place card. Daniel and I met 7 years ago at a networking event where he was the confident, the talker, the man everyone remembered. I fell in love with his certainty, his way of walking into rooms like he owned them. Back then, I admired how he took charge. I didn't notice how quickly he took charge of standing in that glittering ballroom. I wondered when admiration had quietly turned into something that felt like disappearing. The charity began because of my mother. She spent her final years in a care facility that couldn't afford basic art supplies for their therapy programs. I watched her fade without color, without creativity, without dignity. After she passed, I couldn't sleep for months. One night, I started writing a plan. I wanted elderly patients to have beauty in their last chapters. That mission came from my grief, not from anyone else's ambition. Daniel supported the idea initially, or at least he said the right words. He helped me file paperwork and introduced me to his business contacts. Somewhere along the way, he started saying "we" when he talked about the foundation. Then we became "I" when important people were listening. I noticed but said nothing. Keeping peace felt easier than claiming territory. I told myself partnership meant sharing credit, even when the sharing felt one-sided. Margaret Chun, our largest sponsor, arrived wearing emerald silk and her signature warm smile. She had believed in my vision from the very first meeting, writing a check before I even finished my presentation. Margaret saw something in me that I sometimes struggled to see in myself. She squeezed my hand as she passed, and I felt a flicker. Her confidence in me had never wavered, even when my own confidence had grown quieter over the years. Guests filled the room, and I moved through them like a ghost in my own event. I greeted donors, answered questions, solved a last-minute seating issue. Daniel worked the crowd differently, shaking hands firmly, accepting compliments about his foundation with gracious nods. I watched him from across the room and felt something cold settle in my chest. This was supposed to be night. Why did I feel like a stranger at my own celebration? The comment he made earlier kept replaying in my just the planner. He had said it so casually, like it was obvious, like it was true. Maybe he believed it. Maybe after years of stepping forward while I stepped back, he had genuinely forgotten where this all started. Or maybe he remembered perfectly and simply decided his version of the story sounded better. I wasn't sure which possibility hurt more. Dinner was served, and I barely tasted the salmon I had selected after 3 catering tables. Daniel sat beside me, charming our table mates with stories about nonprofit challenges and community impact. He used phrases I had written in grant applications. He described programs I had designed during late nights at our kitchen table. His delivery was flawless. The words were mine. I pushed food around my plate and smiled when people looked my way. Margaret took the stage after dessert, and the room settled into attentive silence. She spoke about the importance of giving back, about the difference one organization can make in countless lives. I expected her to thank the donors, maybe mention Daniel, since he had positioned himself as the public face. Instead, she paused and looked directly at me. My heart stumbled. Something in her expression told me the evening was about to shift in a direction I hadn't anticipated. 3 years ago, Margaret said, a young woman walked into my office with a handwritten business plan and tears in her eyes. The room was utterly still. She told me about her mother, about watching creativity bring comfort to people in their final days. She didn't ask for recognition. She asked for supplies, for instructors, for dignity. Margaret smiled at me. That woman is Chloe Harper, and she is the founder of this incredible organization." Applause erupted, but I could barely hear it over the rushing in my ears. People turned to look at me with new expressions, seeing me perhaps for the first time. Daniel's face went pale beside me, his confident smile frozen into something rigid and unreadable. I rose slowly from my chair, my legs unsteady beneath my gown. The walk to the stage felt like miles. Every step carried the weight of years spent staying small. Margaret embraced me at the microphone, and I inhaled the scent of her perfume, grounding myself in something real. "Tell them," she whispered in my ear. "Tell them your story." I faced the crowd, hundreds of faces waiting, and found that the words I had kept inside for so long were ready to finally come out. My voice shook at first, then steadied. I spoke about my mother, about color and hope, and refusing to let people fade away unnoticed. I didn't look at Daniel while I spoke. I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the elderly couple near the front who had benefited from our programs. I watched a young volunteer wipe her eyes. I let their responses guide me through sentences I hadn't planned, but somehow knew by heart. For the first time in years, I wasn't performing supportive wife or humble helper. I was simply Chloe, telling the truth about something I had built with my own broken heart. When I finished, the applause was different than before. Warmer, more personal, directed unmistakably at me. People stood from their chairs. Margaret beamed beside me. I descended the stage steps carefully, accepting handshakes and kind words from strangers who now knew my name, my real role, my actual contribution. Daniel remained seated at our table, staring at his water glass. I felt his silence across the room like a temperature change. The rest of the evening blurred into congratulations and business cards pressed into my palm. Donors who had previously spoken only to Daniel now sought me out specifically. They asked about expansion plans, about my mother, about how they could help more. I answered with growing confidence, surprised by how naturally authority fit once I allowed myself to claim it. Years of preparation met this single moment of permission. Daniel found me near the coat check as the gala wound down. His expression had shifted from shock to something more complicated, a mixture of embarrassment and something that looked almost like fear. "We should talk," he said quietly. I nodded, but I didn't apologize for the evening's revelation. I didn't rush to reassure him or soften the edges of what had happened. I simply agreed that, yes, we had much to discuss. The drive home was silent except for the hum of the engine. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw working without producing words. I watched streetlights pass and thought about all the small surrenders that had led to tonight. Every time I had let him speak for me, every dinner where I changed the subject rather than correct his exaggeration. I had been complicit in my own erasure, and that truth was harder to face than his betrayal. Inside our house, Daniel finally spoke. "Why didn't you say something before? If the credit mattered so much, why did you let me?" He stopped, unable to finish. I realized he genuinely didn't understand. He thought tonight was about ego, about scorekeeping, about winning some competition I had never agreed to enter. He missed the point entirely. This wasn't about credit. This was about existence, about being seen as a whole person rather than a supporting character. I told him about the exact moment I had stopped correcting people. It was a dinner party 2 years ago when he casually called the foundation my project in front of his boss. I had opened my mouth to clarify, caught his warning glance, and swallowed my words instead. That night, something inside me went quiet. I began believing his version might be easier than fighting for mine. I chose peace over truth, and lost pieces of myself in the bargain. Daniel sat heavily on our couch, his expensive suit suddenly looking wrinkled and tired. "I didn't mean to take anything from you," he said. His voice cracked slightly, and I recognized genuine confusion beneath his defensiveness. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who had grown comfortable with advantages he never examined. That made everything more complicated than simple anger could address. I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition, partnership, and respect. We talked until the early morning light crept through our windows. I learned things about his insecurities I had never suspected, his fear of being ordinary, his need to feel essential. He learned how invisible I had felt, how small his careless words had made me over years of accumulation. Neither of us solved anything that night, but we began the harder work of actually seeing each other. Real marriage might require this kind of painful honesty. The weeks following the gala brought changes I hadn't expected. Daniel stepped back from foundation events, encouraging me to take meetings alone. At first, his absence felt strange, almost suspicious. Gradually, I recognized it as genuine effort, his clumsy attempt at correction. I started introducing myself as founder without hesitation, without glancing sideways for permission. The word fit differently now, like a coat I had finally grown into after years of it hanging loose. My mother would have laughed at the gala drama, I think. She never cared much about credit or recognition. She painted watercolors in her care facility room, giving them away to nurses and visitors, never signing her name. But she also taught me that women often carry weight without acknowledgement. And sometimes, you have to set the burden down loudly enough for others to notice it existed. Maybe Margaret's announcement was my way of finally honoring that lesson. I still organize events and arrange centerpieces and choose napkin colors. Those skills haven't disappeared, and I've stopped pretending they're less valuable than boardroom negotiations. But now, when sponsors call, they ask for Chloe Harper. When newspapers write about our programs, my name appears first. Daniel reads those articles without complaint, sometimes even highlighting passages about my mother's legacy. We are rebuilding something, slowly and imperfectly. And I am learning that claiming your own story is just the beginning of writing a new one. 3 months after the gala, Daniel suggested we attend couples therapy. The suggestion surprised me because he had always dismissed therapy as unnecessary, something for people who couldn't solve their own problems. But he made the appointment himself, chose a counselor with good reviews, and drove us there on a rainy Tuesday evening. I sat in the passenger seat wondering if this was genuine change or another performance. Only time would reveal which version of my husband had made this decision. Dr. Reena Patel had a calm office with soft lighting and tissues strategically placed on every surface. She asked us to describe our marriage in 3 words each. Daniel said comfortable, successful, strained. I said quiet, unbalanced, hopeful. We both paused at our own answers, hearing them aloud for the first time. Dr. Patel nodded without judgment and wrote something in her notebook. That first session cracked open conversations we had been avoiding for years beneath polite dinner talk. The therapy homework felt awkward at first. We had to share one appreciation and one frustration each night before bed. Daniel struggled with the frustration part, often deflecting with humor or vague complaints about work stress. I struggled with appreciations, realizing how rarely I had noticed his efforts recently. Resentment had built a film over my vision, making everything he did look suspicious or insufficient. Cleaning that lens required effort I hadn't anticipated when I agreed to try. Margaret invited me to lunch at her favorite restaurant downtown. She wanted to discuss expanding the foundation into 2 new cities, a growth opportunity that would have terrified me a year ago. Now, I listened with genuine excitement, asking questions about logistics and funding timelines. Margaret smiled at my engagement. "You're different lately," she observed. "More present." I told her about therapy, about the gala's aftermath, about learning to take up space. She squeezed my hand across the white tablecloth. The expansion required hiring additional staff, which meant interviews and decisions that used to paralyze me with self-doubt. I created job postings, reviewed resumes, and conducted conversations with strangers who wanted to join something I had built. Each interview strengthened my sense of ownership. These people weren't applying to work for Daniel's organization. They were applying to work for mine. The distinction mattered more than I could have explained to anyone who hadn't lived inside my particular invisibility. Daniel came home one evening with flowers and an apology I hadn't requested. He had been thinking about the dinner party 2 years ago, the one where he first called the foundation his project. He remembered my face that night, how something flickered and then went dark behind my eyes. He had noticed, but chose not to ask. "I was selfish," he admitted, arranging tulips in a vase. I saw you dimming and did nothing. His honesty created unexpected space between us. I hired a young woman named Jasmine as our new program coordinator. She reminded me of myself at 25, eager and talented, but constantly apologizing for her own competence. During her first week, I watched her shrink in meetings, deferring to louder voices even when her ideas were stronger. I recognized that shrinking intimately. After one particularly painful meeting, I asked her to stay behind. "Your thoughts matter," I told her. "Practice saying them like you believe it." Jasmine became something between a mentee and a mirror. Coaching her forced me to articulate lessons I was still learning myself. I couldn't tell her to claim space while I continued making myself small in other areas of my life. Her growth demanded my growth. We developed a shorthand in meetings, small nods of encouragement when the other spoke up. Watching her confidence build felt like watching my younger self get a second chance at self-trust. Therapy revealed patterns I hadn't consciously recognized. Dr. Patel pointed out how I often asked Daniel's opinion before stating my own, even about things I knew better. She noticed how I apologized before disagreeing, softening every contradiction until it barely registered. Daniel had his own patterns, habits of interruption, and assumption he had never examined. We were both products of families and cultures that had shaped us without our permission. Understanding that made forgiveness feel more possible. The Foundation's anniversary celebration approached, and this year I plan to give the keynote speech myself. No sharing the stage, no deferring to Daniel's easier public presence. I wrote drafts at our kitchen table, crossing out phrases that sounded like someone else, searching for words that sounded like me. Daniel read an early version and offered suggestions gently, as a partner rather than an editor. His restraint felt like a gift neither of us would have recognized before. My sister called from California, asking about the marriage rumors she had heard through family channels. I hadn't told her about therapy or the gala confrontation. We had grown distant over the years, our conversations reduced to birthday texts and holiday obligations. But something about this season of honesty made me want to reconnect. I told her everything, and she listened without interrupting. "I always thought you disappeared into that marriage," she finally said. "I'm glad you're finding yourself again." Her words stayed with me for days. Disappeared. Had everyone seen what I couldn't? Had my gradual erasure been visible to outside observers while I remained blind inside it? I thought about friends who had drifted away, family gatherings where I spoke less and smiled more. The pattern was everywhere once I started looking. I hadn't just lost myself in my marriage. I had lost myself in a version of womanhood that prized accommodation over authenticity. That realization burned slowly through old assumptions. Daniel and I started taking evening walks around our neighborhood. The therapist suggested it, something about movement helping difficult conversations flow more easily. She was right. Walking side by side rather than facing each other made vulnerability feel safer. We talked about children, about whether we still wanted them, about what kind of parents we might become if we did. Those conversations had stalled years ago. Now they breathed again, cautious, but alive with genuine possibility. The anniversary event arrived on a clear October evening. I stood backstage, note cards trembling slightly in my hand. Daniel found me there, adjusting his tie in the mirror beside me. "You're going to be wonderful," he said, and for once I believed he meant it without reservation. He kissed my forehead and went to find his seat in the audience. I watched him go, this complicated man I was slowly learning to see clearly. We were both works in progress. My speech told the Foundation's story from the beginning, from my mother's watercolors to Margaret's first check to the thousands of elderly patients we had served. I spoke about collaboration and about the danger of disappearing into partnership. I spoke about finding your voice after years of comfortable silence. The audience listened differently than they had at the gala. This wasn't revelation. This was declaration. I was no longer surprising them with my existence. I was simply existing fully and unapologetically. Afterward, donors approached with checkbooks and expansion ideas. Jasmine handled logistics with growing confidence, directing guests and answering questions without glancing at me for approval. I watched her work and felt something like maternal pride. though she was only 8 years younger than me. Daniel mingled appropriately, introducing himself as the founder's husband with what seemed like genuine comfort. The role reversal would have felt impossible a year ago. Now it felt like balance finally achieved. Margaret found me near the dessert table, sampling chocolate truffles I had chosen after extensive tastings. "Your mother would be proud," she said simply. The words cracked something open in my chest. I had been so focused on professional recognition that I had forgotten why any of this mattered. My mother's face in that care facility, brightening when volunteers brought art supplies. Her hands still graceful despite the tremors, creating beauty until the very end. This foundation was her legacy breathing through me. Driving home that night, Daniel reached for my hand across the center. The gesture felt different now, weighted with months of difficult work and fragile reconstruction. "I'm proud of you," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "It's not because of the speech or the donors, because you became someone who could give that speech." I watched it happen. I squeezed his hand back, acknowledging the observation without deflecting. Receiving compliments was its own form of practice. We pulled into our driveway and sat in the parked car, neither of us rushing to go inside. The house looked warm through the windows, lamps glowing in rooms we had decorated together years ago. I thought about all the conversations those walls had witnessed, the silences, and the small surrenders. I thought about what those rooms might witness next, what version of us would continue living there. The future felt open in a way it hadn't for a very long time. I turned to Daniel in the darkness of our car. "I don't know if we're going to make it," I said honestly, "but I know I want to try with the real versions of us, not the performing version." He nodded slowly, and I saw tears catching streetlight in his eyes. "The real versions," he repeated. "I want that too." We sat there together, two people choosing each other again with full knowledge of the costs. The engine cooled and ticked beneath us, marking time in a changed marriage. Winter arrived with unexpected harshness that year, freezing pipes and canceling foundation events across the region. I spent December rescheduling programs and reassuring donors that delays wouldn't derail our expansion plan. The cold felt symbolic somehow, a pause forced upon us after months of constant motion. Daniel and I found ourselves home together more often, sharing blankets on the couch, watching snow accumulate on our unchanged lawn. Stillness revealed things that busyness had conveniently hidden from view. Dr. Patel suggested we take a weekend away, somewhere neutral without the weight of our shared history in every room. Daniel booked a cabin in the mountains, a place neither of us had visited before. The drive took 4 hours through increasingly white land. We talked about small things, avoiding the larger questions that therapy had surfaced but not resolved. By the time we arrived, darkness had fallen and the cabin glowed golden against the snow. That first night, we cooked dinner together in the unfamiliar kitchen. Daniel chopped vegetables, while I stirred sauce. Our movements coordinated from years of shared meals, but something felt different without our usual distractions. No television, no phones buzzing, no foundation emergencies demanding attention. Just two people in a quiet space, confronting what remained when everything else was stripped and away. I wondered if we would find enough substance to sustain us through whatever came next. After dinner, Daniel built a fire while I washed dishes. The domesticity felt tender and terrifying simultaneously. I watched his back as he arranged logs, remembering the younger man who had swept me into his confident orbit. That man still existed somewhere inside this more uncertain version. I dried my hands and joined him on the rug before the growing flame. The warmth reached my face before the silence between us could turn uncomfortable or cold. He told me about his father that night, stories I had never heard in 7 years of marriage. His father had been a quiet man, overshadowed by Daniel's more ambitious mother. He had watched his father disappear into supportive roles, making himself smaller to accommodate her larger presence. Daniel had vowed never to become invisible like that. The irony hit us both simultaneously. He had spent our marriage ensuring his visibility by diminishing mine instead. I shared things too, memories of my mother's marriage to my father, how she had managed the household while he managed the narrative. She cooked and cleaned and raised children while he told dinner party stories about family adventures where she appeared only as a supporting character. I had inherited her talent for accommodation without realizing it. Seeing the pattern clearly felt like finally reading instructions that had been written in a language I was only now learning to understand. The cabin weekend cracked us open in ways therapy hadn't quite reached. Something about the neutral territory, the absence of familiar furniture holding familiar tension. We cried together on that mountain, grieving the marriage we thought we had and the people we thought we were. We also laughed, finding unexpected humor in our mutual blindness. How had two reasonably intelligent people built such elaborate architectures of avoidance? The question itself became a kind of intimacy, shared bewilderment connecting us. We returned home, changed, but uncertain what shape the change would take. The house felt different, smaller somehow, or maybe we had simply grown too large for its familiar room. I walked through spaces I had decorated years ago and noticed how little of myself appeared in the choices. Neutral colors Daniel preferred, furniture his mother had suggested. Even the art on our walls reflected his taste more than mine. I had moved into his life rather than building one together. January brought a decision I hadn't anticipated making. The foundation needed a permanent office, and I found the perfect space in a building downtown. But signing the lease required financial commitment beyond our current budget. Daniel offered to co-sign, to intertwine our personal finances with my professional. I declined. The refusal surprised us both. I wanted the foundation to stand on its own, independent of our marriage's uncertain. He understood, without requiring explanation. Margaret helped me secure alternative funding through a grant I had been too intimidated to pursue before. The application required extensive documentation of my qualifications, my vision, my specific contributions to the organization's success. Writing those pages forced me to catalog accomplishments I had minimized for years. Seeing my work listed in official language made it undeniably real. I submitted the application and waited, practicing the unfamiliar skill of believing I deserved what I was asking for. The grant came through in February. Enough funding to cover 2 years of office rent, plus additional programming. I signed the lease alone. My signature steady on the line marked founder and executive director. The title had always been technically accurate. Now it felt emotionally true as well. I stood in the empty office space, imagining desks and computers and staff members bringing our mission to life. The room smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Daniel helped me move furniture that weekend, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs without complaint. He assembled shelving units while I organized files, both of us sweating despite the February chill. Working together physically felt easier than talking sometimes. Our bodies remembered partnership even when our minds struggled with its redefinition. By evening, the office looked almost ready. We sat on the floor eating takeout, exhausted and oddly peaceful amid the cardboard boxes. Jasmine arrived Monday morning with coffee and enthusiasm that made me feel both old and hopeful. She had ideas for the new space, suggestions for workflow improvements, questions about our expansion timeline. Her energy filled the rooms I had emptied myself into. I realized I was building something that would outlast my direct involvement, an organization with its own momentum and identity. The thought brought unexpected relief. Legacy meant eventually letting go. Spring thaw revealed cracks in our foundation's first program site, requiring emergency repairs and budget reallocation. The crisis consumed weeks of careful planning, demanding solutions I had to invent under pressure. Daniel watched me navigate the emergency with something like admiration. "You're good at this," he observed one evening. "The hard stuff. You don't freeze." I considered his words carefully. He was right. Somewhere along the way, I had become someone who could handle difficulty without disappearing into it. Dr. Patel asked us to envision our marriage 5 years forward. Daniel described continued growth, children, possibly, a partnership of equals supporting each other's ambitions. His vision sounded beautiful and rehearsed, like something from a magazine article about healthy relationships. When my turn came, I hesitated. The honest answer felt dangerous to speak aloud. I wasn't sure I saw him in my future clearly anymore. The uncertainty wasn't anger. It was something quieter and more final. I told him that night, sitting at our kitchen table where I had once sketched the foundation's first plans. The words came slowly, carefully, without accusation or blame. I loved him still, but I wasn't sure that love was enough to build the next chapter on. He listened without interrupting, his face cycling through emotions I recognized from years of reading his expressions. When I finished, he didn't argue or defend or try to fix anything. He simply asked what I needed, and I didn't have an answer yet. We agreed to a trial separation, something Dr. Patel had mentioned as a possibility months ago. Daniel would stay with his brother temporarily while we figured out what space might teach us. The decision felt both devastating and necessary, like surgery that might save the patient or confirm the diagnosis was terminal. We packed his bags together on a Sunday afternoon, neither of us crying, both of us too exhausted for the obvious emotions the moment seemed to demand. The house felt enormous without him. I wandered rooms that suddenly contained only my own presence, my own choices, my own silence. The loneliness was real and sharp. But underneath it, I discovered something unexpected: relief, space, room to breathe without constantly monitoring his reactions, adjusting my shape to fit his needs. I hadn't realized how much energy accommodation required until I stopped spending it. The quiet was painful and precious simultaneously. Margaret called when she heard the news through mutual friends. She didn't offer advice or predictions about reconciliation. She simply asked if I wanted company for dinner, and I said yes before I could overthink the acceptance. We ate pasta at her kitchen table, two women at different life stages comparing notes on love and loss. She had been divorced twice before finding peace in her own company. "Sometimes the bravest thing is admitting when something has ended," she said softly. I slept alone in our bed for the first time in 7 years, spreading into the space Daniel's body had always occupied. The mattress felt different without his weight creating familiar valleys. I stared at the ceiling and thought about my mother in her final months, how she had told me that marriage was wonderful, but selfhood was essential. I hadn't understood then. The ceiling offered no answers, but the question itself felt like progress towards something I couldn't yet name. The separation stretched into weeks, then a full month. Daniel texted daily at first, small updates about his brother's apartment, questions about the house, careful inquiries about my well-being. Gradually, the texts became less frequent, settling into a rhythm that felt more honest than the constant checking. We were learning to exist separately, testing whether independence felt like freedom or amputation. Some days, I couldn't tell the difference between the two sensations. I threw myself into foundation work with intensity that concerned even Jasmine. She found me at the office past midnight twice, surrounded by grant applications and cold coffee. "You're allowed to feel things," she said gently, closing my laptop. "Work won't fix this." She was right, of course, but work gave me somewhere to put the energy that grief kept generating. Productivity felt safer than sitting with the hollow ache that waited whenever I stopped moving. Margaret invited me to a women's leadership conference in Chicago, suggesting the change of scenery might offer perspective. I almost declined, citing foundation responsibilities and budget concerns, but something in her voice told me this wasn't really about professional development. She saw me spiraling and was offering a lifeline disguised as network. I booked the flight and packed grateful for friends who intervened without making their interventions feel like charity. The conference hotel hummed with ambitious women discussing strategy and growth and breaking barriers. I attended panels about nonprofit leadership, about work-life balance, about building organizations that reflected personal values. Every speaker seemed to have navigated struggles similar to mine. Marriages that complicated careers, identities that got lost in partnerships, moments of reckoning that forced difficult choices. Their honesty gave me permission to examine my own situation without predetermined conclusions about what healing should look like. One evening, I sat alone at the hotel bar, nursing wine I didn't particularly want. A woman about my age took the adjacent stool and ordered whiskey with practice. We started talking about the conference, then about our work, then about the Messier territories of personal life. Her name was Sandra, divorced 3 years, running a literacy nonprofit in Denver. She described her marriage's end without bitterness, with something closer to gratitude for lessons learned through painful experience. Sandra's perspective shifted something in my thinking. She spoke about divorce not as failure but as completion, a chapter that had run its natural course. "Some marriages are meant to last forever," she said. "Some are meant to teach you who you are." I turned her words over like stones, examining them from different angles. My marriage to Daniel had certainly taught me things. Whether those lessons required continued enrollment remained the central unanswered question. I called Daniel from my hotel room that night, the first actual phone conversation since he moved out. His voice sounded tired but warm, familiar in ways that made my chest ache. We talked about nothing important, weather and work and his brother's terrible cooking. The normalcy felt precious and painful. I missed him, I realized. Not the diminished version of our marriage, but him, the person underneath the patterns we had built together. That distinction mattered more than I had understood before. Flying home, I watched clouds from my window seat and thought about what I actually wanted. Not what seemed reasonable or mature or least disruptive. What I genuinely desired when I stripped away everyone else's expectations and opinions. The answer surprised me with its simplicity. I wanted partnership without disappearance. I wanted to be seen completely and loved anyway. Whether Daniel could offer that remained uncertain, but at least I finally knew what to ask for clearly. Dr. Patel suggested a joint session when our first in 6 weeks. Daniel looked thinner, his confidence less polished than usual. We sat on opposite ends of her couch, the space between us charged with everything. She asked us each to share one thing we had learned during this. Daniel went first, his voice cracking slightly. "I learned that I don't know how to be alone," he admitted, "and that terrifies me more than losing you does." His honesty broke something open in the room. I found myself crying before I could speak, tears I had been holding since the night he left. When words finally came, they surprised me. "I learned that I can be alone," I said. "And that's exactly why I might be able to stay." Dr. Patel nodded slowly, recognizing the shift neither of us had consciously planned. Something fundamental had changed during our time apart, something that might actually make togetherness possible. We didn't reconcile that day. Dr. Patel cautioned against rushing, against letting relief override the careful work still required, but we agreed to weekly dinners, neutral territory where we could practice being together without the weight of shared domesticity. The arrangement felt appropriately tentative, hopeful, without being naive. We had hurt each other too much for easy resolution, but we had also grown enough to attempt something more honest than what we had built before. The first dinner happened at an Italian restaurant we had never visited together. New territory for a new attempt. Daniel asked about the conference, about foundation expansion, about Jasmine's development as a leader. His questions felt genuine rather than performative, interested rather than competitive. I told him about Sandra, about the bar conversation that had clarified my thinking. He listened without defensiveness, without trying to argue or explain away the implications of what I was sharing. Spring arrived properly, thawing the last stubborn snow and filling our foundation's new office with aggressive sunlight. I hired 2 additional staff members, delegating responsibilities I had clutched too tightly before. Letting go felt counterintuitive but necessary. The organization needed to grow beyond my individual capacity. Watching capable people execute my vision with their own creativity taught me that building something lasting meant eventually trusting others to carry it forward without constant supervision. Daniel and I graduated from weekly dinners to occasional weekend activities. We hiked a trail neither of us had explored before, stopping at viewpoints to catch our breath and admire landscapes that held no memories. He reached for my hand on a steep descent, steadying me on loose gravel. The touch felt electric and ordinary simultaneously. Our bodies remembered intimacy, our minds were still negotiating. I didn't pull away, but I noticed my own hesitation before relaxing into his grip. He asked about moving back home on a quiet Sunday afternoon. We were sitting in a park, watching children chase pigeons, existing in comfortable silence that had become increasingly common. But the question didn't surprise me. We had been building toward it but I wasn't ready to answer directly. Instead, I asked what he imagined home meaning now, after everything. His response would tell me whether he understood what had changed or simply wanted to restore what was familiar and convenient. He took his time answering, which I appreciated. The old Daniel would have responded immediately with reassurances designed to close the conversation efficiently. This Daniel sat with the question, considering its actual weight. Home means the place where you're most yourself, he finally said. I want to live somewhere you don't have to perform. If our house can become that, I want to come back. If it can't, then maybe home is somewhere we haven't found yet. His answer moved me in ways I hadn't expected. He had been listening all these months, really hearing what I struggled to articulate about invisibility and accommodation. The man beside me on this park bench was not the same man who had smirked about me being just the planner. Growth had happened on both sides of our separation. Whether that growth pointed toward reunion or respectful parting remained genuinely unclear, and somehow that uncertainty felt appropriate rather than frightening. I told him I needed more time, and he accepted without argument or pressure. We continued our gradual reconstruction, adding movie nights and Sunday brunches to our repertoire of shared activity. Each encounter revealed new dimensions of who we were becoming separately and potentially together. I learned he had started therapy individually, working through family patterns we had only scratched the surface of during couples sessions. His commitment to self-examination felt like the most romantic gesture he had ever offered. The Foundation's first anniversary in our new office arrived with celebration I could finally, fully enjoy. Staff gathered for cake and champagne, donors stopped by with congratulations, and local news covered our expansion story with generous. Daniel attended as my guest, introducing himself to strangers as my biggest supporter. The words sounded different from his previous claims of co-founding credit, smaller in scope but larger in meaning. He was learning to take pride in my success without needing to claim ownership. I watched him across the crowded room. This man I had married and almost left and might yet build something new with. He caught my eye and smiled. A private expression meant only for me amid the public celebration. 7 years of history lived in that smile, pain and growth and cautious hope all present simultaneously. I smiled back, allowing myself to feel the full complexity of loving someone imperfectly while becoming yourself more completely. The party continued around us, but that moment existed outside time. Summer arrived with decisions I could no longer postpone. Daniel had been patient for months, giving me space while gently indicating his readiness to rebuild our shared life. The foundation was thriving, my sense of self stronger than it had ever been. All the external pieces had fallen into place. Only the central question remained unanswered, suspended between us like fruit waiting to be picked or left to fall. I knew the season for choosing had finally come. I visited my mother's grave on a warm June morning, something I did whenever major decisions loomed. The cemetery was quiet except for birdsong and distant lawnmower. I sat on the grass beside her headstone and talked, telling her about Daniel and the separation and my uncertainty about what came. She couldn't answer, of course, but speaking to her clarified my own thinking in ways solitary reflection never quite achieved. Her silence held space for my truth. What would she have advised? I considered the question seriously, remembering her marriage to my father and its complicated texture. She had stayed, accommodating his larger presence until death separated them. But she had also told me once that staying was her choice, not her sentence. She had found ways to remain herself within partnership, small rebellions of selfhood I only recognized looking backward. Perhaps the question wasn't whether to stay, but how to stay without disappearing again. Daniel met me for lunch that afternoon at the restaurant where we'd had our first post-separation dinner. The symmetry felt intentional, a return to the beginning of our reconstruction. He looked healthy, more relaxed than the anxious man who had moved out 6 months earlier. Individual therapy had softened some of his sharper edges. He asked about my cemetery visit without judgment, understanding that my mother remained a presence in decisions she would never witness directly. His acceptance of my grief rituals touched me deeply. I told him I was ready to talk about the future, really talk without deflection or delay. His face shifted through several emotions before settling on careful attention. We ordered food neither of us would taste properly, the meal serving as excuse for the conversation it accompanied. I started by acknowledging everything that had changed, in me, in him, in the space between us. The accounting took time. Growth deserved documentation before we could discuss what it might enable. He listened without interrupting, a skill he had genuinely developed rather than performed. When I finished, he shared his own inventory of changes. He had examined his need for visibility, understanding finally how it connected to childhood fears of becoming invisible like his father. He had learned to celebrate my success without feeling diminished by it. He had practiced being alone, discovering that solitude was survivable even if uncomfortable. His self-awareness had deepened beyond anything I would have predicted when we first separated. The question crystallized between us, unspoken but unmistakable. Could two people who had hurt each other so thoroughly build something worth inhabiting? I didn't have certainty. Neither did he. But I realized certainty might be the wrong standard entirely. Marriage wasn't a destination where you arrived and unpacked permanently. It was daily choosing, repeated commitment, ongoing construction. The version of us that existed now might be capable of building better than the version that had nearly collapsed under accumulated small betrayals. I reached across the table and took his hand. The gesture contained my answer before words could articulate it. His eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide, and I felt my own vision blur in response. I want to try, I said. Not go back to what we were. Build something new with who we've become. He nodded, unable to speak, squeezing my fingers with pressure that communicated everything his voice couldn't manage in that moment of overwhelming relief. We didn't rush the reunion. Daniel moved back gradually, a few belongings at a time, letting the house adjust to his returning presence. I noticed how he asked before reclaiming spaces, checking whether his things belonged where they had always been or somewhere new. The consideration felt revolutionary after years of assumed ownership. We were negotiating shared territory with fresh awareness, treating our home as something we were creating together, rather than a space he inhabited while I maintained it. Dr. Patel continued seeing us monthly, maintaining the scaffolding while we tested new foundations. She celebrated our progress while cautioning against complacency. Patterns built over years didn't dissolve in months. We would face triggers and setbacks, moments when old dynamics tried to reassert themselves. The difference now was awareness. We could catch ourselves falling into familiar grooves and consciously redirect. Vigilance felt exhausting sometimes, but the alternative was returning to the slow erosion that had nearly destroyed us before. The foundation hosted its largest gala yet that October. 200 donors filled a ballroom I had chosen, eating food I had selected, supporting programs I had designed. Daniel sat at a table near the front, applauding when I took the stage and beaming with uncomplicated pride. No smirking comments about planners, no subtle claims of co-ownership, just a husband celebrating his wife's achievement with genuine joy. The contrast with the gala 2 years earlier felt almost impossible to reconcile with memory. Margaret gave a speech acknowledging my leadership and growth. She had watched my transformation from hesitant founder to confident executive director, and her words reflected that witness journey. When she mentioned the early days, the handwritten business plan, and the tears in her office, I let myself feel pride rather than deflecting with modesty. I had built this. Not alone, never alone, but from vision that originated in my grief and determination. Claiming that truth no longer felt like arrogance, it felt like accuracy. Jasmine had risen to assistant director, her confidence now matching her competence. Watching her command the gala logistics reminded me how far we had both traveled. She caught my eye across the crowded room and raised her glass in private tone. We had taught each other things neither could have learned alone. Her growth validated my leadership. My example had accelerated her willingness to take space. The reciprocity felt like one of my proudest professional achievements, building people alongside programs. That night, Daniel and I walked home through quiet streets, the October air crisped with approaching autumn. We held hands like newlyweds, though our intertwined fingers carried 7 years of history rather than fresh infatuation. He told me he loved who I had become without wishing I was someone easier. The words landed in places I hadn't realized were still waiting for such specific reassurance. I told him I loved his willingness to change, his courage to examine himself honestly. We exchanged vulnerabilities like gifts. Winter brought the anniversary of our separation, a milestone we acknowledged without dwelling in its shadow. 1 year since he had packed bags and left me alone with silence that taught me who I was without him. The distance had been necessary, painful, but productive. We might have limped along indefinitely without that rupture, accommodating each other into mutual diminishments. Instead, we had broken apart and chosen to reassemble with intention. The scar tissue was real, but so was the healing underneath. I turned 36 that December, celebrating with a small dinner that included Margaret, Jasmine, and Daniel. 3 people who had witnessed my transformation from different angles, each contributing something essential to the person blowing out candle. My wish was private but simple. I wanted to keep becoming, to resist the temptation of arrival, to remember that growth required ongoing attention rather than singular achievement. The candles extinguished icily, and I chose to interpret that as favorable omen. Daniel surprised me at Christmas with a gift that demonstrated how deeply he had been paying attention. A first edition of my mother's favorite poetry collection. The same book she had read to me as a child. The same verses that had shaped my understanding of beauty and grief. Finding it must have taken months of searching. He had listened to stories I barely remembered telling, cataloging details that mattered to me even when I hadn't emphasized their importance. The thoughtfulness overwhelmed me. Spring arrived again, completing the cycle that had begun with a gala and a cruel comment about planners. I stood in our kitchen, making coffee while Daniel read the newspaper, and felt the ordinary miracle of peaceful coexistence. We had fought for this normalcy, earned it through months of difficult conversation and uncomfortable growth. The morning light caught the flowers he had bought yesterday for no particular reason. Small gestures accumulated into something larger than grand romantic declarations could ever construct. The foundation expanded into its 3rd city that April. I traveled alone to oversee the launch, confident that both my organization and my marriage could function during temporary absence. Daniel texted encouragement without neediness, celebrating my professional milestones without requiring constant connection. We had learned to hold each other loosely, trusting that space between us didn't mean disconnection. Independence and intimacy coexisted now in ways that would have seemed impossible. During the years of my gradual disappearance, I returned home to a husband who had prepared dinner and genuinely wanted to hear about my trip. We ate at the kitchen table, where I had once sketched a grieving daughter's dream of bringing color to people's final days. That dream had become real, larger than I had imagined, sustainable beyond my individual effort. And the marriage I had nearly sacrificed for invisibility had transformed into partnership I could inhabit fully. I was Chloe Harper, founder and wife and woman finally visible to herself. The story continued, but I had learned to write it in my own voice.